Hi, in this video we're going to be looking at the second major division of the Old Testament, the former prophets. The former prophets is a term that readers of English Bibles or Bibles in other languages aren't really familiar with, but the second division of the Hebrew Old Testament, as you'll remember, the Hebrew Old Testament is broken into Torah, prophets, and writings. The prophets are divided into the former prophets and the latter prophets. And the former prophets include most of what we would call the historical books. They include Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and 1st and 2nd Kings. And you'll notice right away, if you're paying attention, that there's no book of Ruth, no book of Esther, no 1st and 2nd Chronicles, no Ezra and Nehemiah. And the reason for that, well, we'll get to that a little bit later, but the editors of the Old Testament put these books, these few among those that we call the historical books, together in the former prophets for a particular reason. The book of Joshua tells the story of the children of Israel, their entry into the Promised Land, takes over from where Moses left off. Joshua was first designated to be the leader in Deuteronomy 31 as Moses was about to die. And so Joshua 1:1 begins with, after the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord calls Joshua and charges Joshua to go into the Promised Land. He says, "Every place where your foot will land, I have already given to you." So there's a little bit of note of grace there. Joshua, as it turns out, is one of the most successful military generals in the history of the world. He has a record of 31 wins and 1 loss. You can read in Joshua chapter 12 the list of the 31 kings that Joshua defeats in his plan to conquer the Promised Land. And the only time he loses is in the first battle of Ai. This is just after the Battle of Jericho. Somebody takes something from Jericho that was supposed to be dedicated to the Lord, and the Lord punishes the people for that by making them lose. After they had won a victory at the big city of Jericho, they lose, are defeated at the relatively small town of Ai. Now, many people are sometimes bothered by the book of Joshua, especially the commands to kill everybody, can kill every man, woman, and child, and even the livestock in the cities. Well, as we look at that, we see that really only once or twice are Joshua and the Israelites commanded to kill everybody. And on top of that, this is typical rhetoric from the ancient Near East. If you'll remember the previous video, we talked about the Merneptah Stela, where the Pharaoh Merneptah proclaimed that he had completely destroyed Israel so that there was not anything of Israel left. Well, this is the same kind of thing. They said whenever they would defeat an enemy that they completely destroyed them, that they killed everybody, regardless of the actual, what we would call the actual body count. But Joshua gives the book of Joshua gives a story of how successful the Israelites were in taking over the land that God had already given them. And that's the key point, after all, is that God gave them the land. This is a theological version of history, a history that involves God and proclaims how God is in control of all the events. The book of Judges gives a little bit different account of how the Israelites settled into the land. we get the impression from Joshua that it was a very quick process, but we get the impression from the book of Judges that it was a little bit more drawn out. Judges says that some of the Canaanites are left in the land in order to teach Israel how to make war, how to be warriors. Because in the ancient world, oftentimes people had to fight. And even in modern times, nations will fight over limited resources, whether those resources are land or people or fresh water or what have you. So Israel had to learn how to defend itself, according to the book of Judges. Whereas there was a very clear transition between Moses and Joshua in moving from the Pentateuch, and particularly the book of Deuteronomy, to the book of Joshua. There aren't as clear succession of leadership from Joshua to the judges. Joshua is a ruler or leader of all the people, just like Moses was a leader of all the people. But the judges tend to be leaders from various of the tribes that rise up for particular crisis events. And the story of the book of Judges is a rather sad one. The Israelites go through a cycle where they seem to forget the Lord. They seem to lose some of their faithfulness toward God. And as a result, God sends an oppressor in the form of an enemy nation that oppresses Israel. And then Israel cries out for help, and God sends a deliverer. And the Israelites are delivered from their oppression, and then as long as that judge lives, they have peace. But then the Israelites begin to forget the Lord again, and they fall into sin again, and God allows them to be oppressed again. The book of Judges ends with a sad note. It says that there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. There was no leader of all of the nation, and so it was a situation where people seemingly did just whatever they wanted to, and God would send oppression because of that. Interesting point in the book of Judges, considering that it ends with the idea that there was no king in Israel. For a bit of Bible trivia that nobody really, or that few people really know, who was the first king of Israel? And if you say Saul, well, sorry, that's not right. Read Judges 9, and you'll find out who was proclaimed the first king of Israel. Wasn't a legitimate king necessarily. He was taking on the role that God had not given him, but nevertheless, he is still proclaimed king of Israel. In the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel, we make another change in how Israelite society is organized. Samuel is an important figure in the history of Israel. He is, at the same time, the last of the judges, and he also anoints the first two of Israel's legitimate kings. Remember the discussion just for the end of the book of Judges. The king by the name of Abimelech proclaimed himself king, but he wasn't legitimate. But Saul and David are the first two legitimate kings. The books of 1st and 2nd Samuel were originally considered a unit, just one book altogether. But later on in the process of transmission of the Bible, they got separated. But the title character dies at the end of book 1, so that forms a kind of a good transition point. And when Israel first moves toward wanting a king, Samuel says that this might not be what you want to do. If you have a king like all the other nations, your king will oppress you, just like the kings of all the other nations oppress their people. But God says to Samuel, go ahead and give the people what they want. Give the people a king, because they are not rejecting you, Samuel, but they are rejecting me as their king over them. So anyway, Samuel does anoint the king, Saul, and King Saul starts out a good king, but power kind of gets to him. He can't really handle the pressure, it seems, and well, to put not too fine a point on it, Saul goes a little crazy. And in the process, we're preparing for the rise of David, and David kills Goliath, gains a great reputation as a good warrior, and David eventually replaces Saul as king over Israel. Saul comes from the tribe of Benjamin. David comes from the tribe of Judah. These two tribes, Judah and Benjamin, later on in the story will be the two tribes that stay together in the southern kingdom after the northern kingdom breaks away. But David is said he's a man after God's own heart. Says God looks on the heart, whereas humans look only on the outward appearance. But David eventually he lets power get to his head too, and he does some things that he ought not to do. He commits adultery with the wife of one of his soldiers and has that soldier killed. And the prophet Nathan comes to him and says, "You have done this very wicked thing in the sight of the Lord." And later on we read that David did everything that God required, did everything that was right in God's eyes, except in the matter of Uriah the Hittite, except in the matter of Uriah and Bathsheba. But nevertheless, God proclaims that He will never take away the lamp that is in Jerusalem. For the sake of His servant David, He will never let the kingship die, so long as David's sons continue in faithfulness to him. And for the most part, they do. Solomon and all the kings that follow after David, some of them are judged to be faithful to God. Some are judged to be not quite so faithful to God. But the Davidic dynasty in the southern part of the land continues on for some 400 years, starting from about 970 BCE to about 586 BC, when Jerusalem is destroyed by the Babylonians. There is always a descendant of David on the throne in Jerusalem throughout that entire time. This is the story that is told in the books of 1st and 2nd Kings. 1st and 2nd Kings tells the story of the Davidic kingship. After David dies, Solomon becomes king, and the nation remains unified during the days of Solomon, but during the days of Rehoboam, Solomon's son, the northern tribes split from the southern tribes. 10 tribes in the north, 2 tribes in the south. And these become Israel in the north, keeps the name Israel. And in the south, they take the name Judah after the tribal territory of Judah and after the tribe of Judah that David and Solomon and Rehoboam and the rest of the Davidic kings come from. Kings, the books of Kings, have the largest historical sweep of all of the books in the former prophets from 970, around the death of David, till 560, when King Jehoiachin, one of the successors who was taken into exile in Babylon, is released from prison and given a place of honor among all of the other kings that were in exile in Babylon. The former prophets all together form a grand historical narrative called the Deuteronomistic history. And this term means that they take their theological foundation, theological drive from the book of Deuteronomy. And in particular, the idea that the people should not forget the Lord their God. Because when they forget the Lord their God, that is when they turn aside to the wrong way and they suffer for it. The books of Joshua to 2 Kings form a grand historical narrative from the time just before the Israelites go into the Promised Land for the first time to the time just before the Israelites go back into the Promised Land for a second time in return from exile. Thank you very much, and we'll see you next time when we talk about the latter prophets.